Konami? I barely even know her, Ami. Sorry, I've got nothing. Nothing except NES Works Gaiden, Casio, Episode 2.
Am I doing all right, kid?
With a little more practice, we could enter the Indy 500.
Flatterer.
I mentioned last episode that Casio managed to land some major publisher licenses for its short-lived disaster of a console. And by major publishers, I mostly meant Konami. This episode brings us even more Konami releases for PV-1000, beginning with what I found to be the rarest game for the system, Tutankham. I don't know why any of the games for PV-1000 would be rarer than the others. I mean, so far as I know, the system had a single retail push in October 1983, at which point all 13 games for the console appear to have been released into the market simultaneously. One would assume that Casio would have shipped every game in equal numbers, you know? But that does not appear to have been the case. Certain titles for PV-1000 are a whole lot easier to come by at auction and at second-hand shops than others. Forget the Mahjong and Pachinko games that clog the arteries of every vintage Japanese console. Titles like Puyan, Super Cobra, Amidar, and even Fighting Bug are a cinch to find. But Tutankham has only shown up for sale online once in the nearly 2 years that I've been working to pull this video series together. That's even fewer times than Dirty Chameleon, the other bizarrely hard-to-find cart for the console. That means that either Casio decided to manufacture fewer of these games than other titles, assuming that no one would want them, or they all shipped in equal quantities, and Casio collectors really love this one. And hey, who could blame them? It's a pretty good game, an oddball maze shooter with a timeless theme of colonialist appropriation and murdering bats, two tentpoles of the medium. Plus, unlike most of Casio's other PV-1000 releases, Tutankham never shipped for another Japanese console, making it something of a rarity. You want Dig Dug? There's no shortage of opportunities to play Dig Dug. Super Cobra? Well, son, what the hell is the Gawkin TV Boy version to you, chopped liver? And of course, several PV-1000 games showed up as superior interpretations on PV-2000. Why mess with the merely okay version of Puyan when you can get the version with arrow deflections? For Tutankham, though, you'd either have to settle for the horrible, sluggish PC 6001 version of the game or import an American console release. So if you were a kid living in Japan in 1983 and your heart was set on blasting the hell out of random wildlife while pilfering Egypt's national treasures, and you didn't want to wait 13 years for Tomb Raiders to show up, Tutankham was your best option. This prospect held more appeal than you might expect. The original Tutankham showed up in arcades in 1982, making this a fairly fresh home release at the time of the PV-1000's launch. And what happened in 1981? That's right, Paramount Pictures released Raiders of the Lost Ark, about a guy who became trapped in an Egyptian tomb. You know, like the one where the preserved body of Pharaoh Tutankham had been discovered 60 years earlier, and had to battle his way to freedom through throngs of snakes. We are, after all, talking about Konami here, and Konami loved to look to Hollywood hits for inspiration. This is the company that gave us Castlevania, the fake horror movie, and traced film stills for the box art to Contra and Metal Gear. Tutankham might, in fact, be the earliest example of Konami lifting from the movies. Not that Tutankham is 100% inspired by Indiana Jones, of course, but taken in the context of 1982, the year that also gave us Pitfall and Montezuma's Revenge, not to mention an actual Raiders of the Lost Ark game for Atari 2600, it's hard not to think that a huge swath of the budding games industry was high on the same supply. So we have Tutankham, a fast-paced maze chase action game. Yeah, it's basically Raiders of the Lost Ark meets Pac-Man meets, Berserk. And it might be the most technically impressive release for the PV-1000 console, with zippy gameplay and plenty happening around the screen, all at any given moment. Bear in mind that the PV-1000's graphical chip was not the most powerful on the console market at the time of its release. It could only display 32 sprites at a time, half the theoretical maximum of Nintendo's Famicom. So the fact that Casio or Konami or whoever ported this arcade title to the console managed to move around so many objects at a time while also allowing the player to fire lengthy beams of laser energy left and right stands as a fairly impressive accomplishment. This is not, however, an arcade-perfect port. The Tutankham coin-op featured fairly large levels that scrolled left and right as you played, but whoever programmed this version evidently decided not to tax the PV-1000's humble hardware, and reworked the game so that each stage fits onto a single screen. This means that rather than containing large stages that scroll left and right and force the player to keep track of goals and objects beyond their current viewpoint, the way the arcade version did, Tutankham for PV-1000 condenses each stage into more compact arrangements. This is not an inverse of Hudson's work the following summer converting Lode Runner mazes into scrolling multi-screen setups. Rather than simply squish each stage into half the width in an attempt at maintaining fidelity, this Tutankham conversion presents players with new level designs that echo the layouts and dynamics of the original without being entirely literal about it. The overall feel of the action works much the same as it did in the arcade, but players can now take in the entire field of play at a glance and don't have to manage quite so much territory. Interestingly, from what I can tell, the PV-1000 release shares its new level designs largely in common with those of the PC 6001 rendition, though that port appears to play like sluggish garbage based on the footage I can find online. However, these are the only two releases of Tutankham that make use of those compacted stage designs. Contemporary releases for American consoles more closely mimic the CoinOps scrolling designs, which suggests that the same studio handled both this and the PC 6001 title. And despite the loss of scrolling, Tutankham on PV-1000 manages to reproduce the essence of the arcade game. You control a little guy in a maze, one of many to appear at the peak of Pac-Mania in the early 80s. But unlike most little maze guys of this era, this explorer comes fully armed. Not only do you wield a laser pistol capable of zapping threats head-on, you also carry smart bombs that clear the screen entirely of threats and briefly prevent monsters from regenerating. These weapons come with limitations. The laser gun can, oddly, only fire left and right. This weighs heavily on how you navigate the maze. Long horizontal passages are essential to travel because you can easily blast any monsters that come along on your level. Vertical passages, on the other hand, you want to avoid because they put you at a tremendous disadvantage. Enemies can approach and kill you from above and below, but you can't counter them. So Tutankham becomes an exercise in managing space, trying to stay clear of vertical corridors while luring enemies into horizontal spaces as best as you can. Sometimes, though, you just can't prevent enemies from causing a traffic jam above or below you, rendering it nearly impossible to pass through unscathed. Even if you do manage to take out a monster or two, up to 4 creatures can populate the screen at a time, and they respawn rapidly from the 2 pink alcoves located around each maze, meaning that your only hope of making it through the thick of things is to launch a smart bomb. Alas, you only have 3 smart bombs per stage, or per life, whichever comes first, which means that you need to deploy them tactically. Every stage is divided in half by a solid barrier wall that you can only pass by stepping into a transporter, and after the first few levels you'll find yourself traveling back and forth between the 2 sections multiple times per stage. You need to collect keys in order to open the door that lets you exit the stage, and you can only carry a single key at a time. Once you pass the point at which each level begins to contain multiple exit doors, you'll need to make round trips through the maze, collecting 1 key, making your way to the doors to open the first lock, then going back into the fray to pick up the other key. And of course you want to collect the treasures along the way for bonus points, obviously. I have no particular personal nostalgia for Tutankham, having only played the arcade version for the first time last summer at Long Island Retro Expo, and never having touched a home port until tracking down Casio's ultra-rare release. But going into it fresh, I think it holds up pretty well. Again, playing like a midpoint between Stern's Berserk and Namco's Pac-Man. And I can't really say whether the compacted stage layouts in the Japanese home releases make for a harder or simpler experience. On one hand, you don't need to keep track of as much space. But on the other hand, you don't have nearly as much room to maneuver and draw enemies into your line of fire. And once enemies emerge from their pink alcoves, they tend to jam up the passages more heavily, since there isn't as much real estate for them to occupy. In summary, it's one of the better maze chase knockoffs of the era, and an interesting twist on Indiana Jones, even if not an entirely authorized one. Those facts, and its technical flair, add up to one of the standout titles for PV-1000. A modest claim to fame for sure, but there are worse reasons to go down in history. And hot on the heels of Tutankham, we have yet another Konami release for PV-1000. This time it's Amidar. I've never directly covered Amidar here, but I did touch on it briefly in the Sorayuki Amida-kun episode of Game Boy Works. That's because both games draw upon the same game tradition, the Japanese pen and paper game of Amida-kuji, which shows up on Wikipedia under the name Ghost Leg, a name that I'm pretty sure is a case of someone pulling our leg. If you have played video games for any respectable, or disrespectable as the case may be, amount of time, you have encountered some sort of variant on Amidar. It consists of a series of parallel vertical lines connected individually by a random assortment of short horizontal bars. Amidar has a single simple rule. You start at the top of one vertical line and trace a path to the bottom. Anytime you encounter a horizontal bar, you need to divert your downward tracing and follow the path across to the next vertical parallel before you can continue your descent. In the end, the arrangement of the horizontal bars determines which point you'll arrive at once you reach the bottom of the screen. The name Amidar translates from Japanese as Buddha's Lottery, which is to say it's presented as a game of chance. Unlike in a pure lottery, Amidar does offer the potential for players to predict their outcome if they're very good at visualizing links at a glance. But generally, games like Super Mario Land present their Amidar variants as a quick bonus opportunity in which you have a split second to choose a starting point and hope for the best. Amidar, however, dares to make Amidar the entire foundation of its gameplay, and it doesn't actually affect you, the player. Instead, the monsters that roam Amidar's maze obey the rules of Amidar. They want to murder your on-screen avatar, but they are thwarted by their lawful evil adherence to the need to make right turns anytime they encounter a junction between two bars. You, on the other hand, simply want to do the Pac-Man thing and claim the entire screen by changing its color. Now that we've seen a few PV-1000 arcade conversions, you should not be surprised to learn that Amidar for PV-1000 does not fully adapt the coin-op cabinet. This is one of two home ports for Amidar for classic consoles, and weirdly enough, the Atari 2600 release turned out to be far more faithful. In arcades, Amidar consisted of two phases of play. In the first, you controlled a gorilla eating coconuts while being pursued by indigenous tribesmen, who show up in a rather unfortunate rendition in this box art. However, that was only true for odd-numbered stages. In even-numbered levels, you instead controlled a paint roller being chased, bizarrely, by pigs. This was one of two arcade games released in 1981 that involved guiding a paint roller through a maze in order to claim territory. I suppose this makes sense as the direction that two different people might take when trying to reinterpret Pac-Man's gameplay into a form about changing a maze's color rather than simply collecting items. But it's still a hell of a coincidence. Anyway, the PV-1000 port drops the even-numbered stage element and simply consists of the odd-numbered design, which grows progressively more challenging as you complete stages. In a way, this does work to Amidar's advantage, since you don't need to switch mental play gears every couple of minutes. But it does result in a game that feels less varied and complex than the freaking Atari 2600 version, which is never a great look. And even within this one-stage format, the PV-1000 version simplifies the game's presentation. In the arcade original, Amidar closely resembled Taito's Quicks, in that you needed to surround a space in order to flip its color. Here, it's enough to simply eat the path and clear away the coconuts from the lines of the stage. The only panels that flip colors once you've claimed them completely are the 4 panels in the corner of the level. Turning a corner square blue also grants you a brief window of invincibility from enemies. In case you weren't clear, the Konami really wanted to create their own Pac-Man here. So the PV-1000 game works the same as the arcade's odd stages, though it doesn't look as dynamic. But since it captures the full scope of those stages' gameplay, I suppose this amounts to splitting hairs. You, the gorilla, need to avoid the Amidars, the tribesmen, who must always turn at junctions rather than pursuing you directly. There is a single enemy dressed in different colors than his allies, the Tracer. The Tracer begins each round by circling the perimeter of the stage, making him easy to avoid. However, after a certain number of full revolutions, the Tracer leaves the perimeter and makes his way into the stage interior. Unlike the Amidars, the Tracer doesn't need to follow Amidar rules. Instead, he goes after the player directly and can make turns at will in order to home in on our hero. You're not entirely helpless against the Tracer, however. In addition to the invincibility mechanic, you also have the ability to smash the ground and cause enemies to flip into the air momentarily, during which time you can zip past them on the ground. This can be a little tricky to manage, admittedly, because the game has some weird hitboxes. Enemies will collide with you in surprising ways and really require you to learn the particulars of how the console registers impacts. It's a pretty decent take on the game, even if it abandons the arcade's even-numbered levels, where you needed to build your stage control outward from converted panels in order to maintain a loaded paint roller. The compromise here is understandable in light of the fact that every game on PV-1000 appears to be compromised, but it does seem unfortunate that this half-complete conversion of Amidar is, so far as I can tell, only one of 2 home ports ever released of the game. It's like Casio and Konami weren't even thinking about preserving the legacy of obscure arcade games for future generations. What a bunch of slackers, I tell you what. Next time on NES Works Gaiden Casio, Konami passes the baton to Namco.